So this is a relatively short introduction to a really simple contrast. Um, I will use the term responsive mode of behavior and the term reactive mode of behavior and what I'm about to read to you. And I don't begin with that terminology, but it's kind of where I end up. And we're talking about dividing activity or behavior into two broad categories. I already mentioned reactive or responsive. We could also say relatively functional or relatively dysfunctional. We could even say relatively ineffective and relatively effective. I'm going to talk about the favorable mode first, and then we'll talk about the unfavorable mode and see some of the contrast, and then I'll come back and contrast it even further toward the end. So to identify this mode of responsiveness or functionality or effectiveness, there are a few very simple stages. The first stage, or even the neutral stage kind of between responsiveness and reactiveness or reactivity, is the stage of calm alertness. However, I'm putting calm alertness as basically part of responsiveness because from calm alertness, responsiveness is the natural, outcome. The natural evolution of calm alertness is towards responsiveness. So we start with calm alertness, and if you don't, have calm alertness right now, you're probably not going to get anything out of this audio. So you might, make sure that you're in a relaxed position. Take a long breath. Hold your breath. Let it be slow. Notice your posture. Be relaxed. If there's a moment of things that you can do to, make it more calm for you to listen to the rest of this, then go ahead and pause it if you need to, and make sure that you have a nice, calm, relaxed environment so that you can be calm and relaxed yourself. You can have a nice, calm pattern of breathing, a relaxed posture, or a comfortable posture if you're reclining. So we've got calm alertness as our foundation. Now, what naturally comes over time if we are operating in calm alertness? Eventually, we become aware of some motivation or focus. Second, after calm alertness, is the awareness of a motivation or focus or interest. Something comes to mind. That's not a problem. That's a basically inevitable thing of, having higher cognitive abilities. If you're calmly alert for a while, the point isn't to be calmly alert for 10 minutes without, any lapse, or to be calmly alert for 10 minutes without any other variation of experience. Calm alertness isn't the pinnacle, it's a foundation. It's not the outcome, you could even say a method, but it's really a basic foundation. A child, a newborn of any species, they have calm alertness at some point. That's kind of their natural state. And then they'll get reactive, or they'll get interested in something. They'll get motivated. They'll see something, an interesting color, or hear an interesting sound, or whatever. That's normal motivation, curiosity. It could be a much more focused motivation or much more intense motivation, but for a very young creature, they're just learning. They might smell something and be like, wait, that smells good. I don't know why, but I want to go closer to that. So those are innate motivations, like, the sense of smell, the sense of hearing, the sense of sight. We see things that are interesting. We hear things that are intriguing, those kind of things. So first was calm alertness. Then second is the awareness of some kind of motivation or focus or interest. Third is a perception of a possible method for pursuing that motivation or focus. So that would really be relevant in particular when it's not immediately obvious. If it's something like I smell something, I'm not sure what that is, but it smells kind of good, I move toward, if it seems like it's coming from the east, then I go to the east, So we don't have a complicated process of identifying a method in that case. But where we have some, more complex outcomes and motivations, then we actually start to experiment with methods, or even speculate on what are possible methods. So to review, First, calm alertness. Second, an awareness of a motivation, or you could say an attraction. And then third, a possible perception, a perception of a possible method for pursuing whatever's attractive, that motivation, that focus, that interest. So fourth and last is the capacity to implement a method. So just because somebody has an interest and even is aware of a method, that doesn't mean they know how to, or maybe they know how to do the method, but they still aren't good at it. They have to actually develop skill or competence or expertise, or maybe they lack resources. So when the motivation is strong enough, they will develop skill over time. They will gather resources or attempt to do so. So fourth and last is the capacity to implement a method that seems favorable, that seems attractive, because that method makes sense, that it would, somebody deductively can tell, yeah, here's a goal I want, here's a method that seems to fit pretty well with that. Now, how do we get good at that method? How do we use that method? So that's the fourth stage of the stage of implementation. That includes all relevant factors to implementation, such as developing expertise, gathering resources, and even assembling collaborators, other experts. It doesn't have to be my expertise for me to have my car repaired. I can hire somebody else to do it that's more of an expert than me. I don't have to learn how to do every possible, competence or skill that's of interest to me. So that was all about functionality, effectiveness, responsiveness. In contrast to those effectiveness-oriented stages or responsiveness-oriented stages, there are also stages of ineffectiveness or dysfunction or reactivity. And I'll explain exactly why I'm using those various terms, because reactivity, I think, is really the best way to describe it. It's not always ineffective to be reactive. I'll say more about that later. So what is the first stage of ineffectiveness? You could say this contrasts with calm alertness. That's fine. The first stage of ineffectiveness or reactivity is frightened alarm. If there's a social context where being frightened can result in being ridiculed and harassed, then we have a second stage almost instantly arises. It would be common to experience panic or shame in relation to the affright, in relation to the alarm. We don't want to be harassed or ridiculed, so we hide, or we either withdraw. That would be kind of the panic response. Or if we can't withdraw, we're in a group of people and we can't escape from the group, and we're concerned that they're going to harass us for being frightened or alarmed. Shame is what is the adaptive response, the adaptive coping mechanism is shame. What does that mean? Shyness, hiding our actual experience, shame. In that case of being concerned about ridicule and harassment for the experience of fright and alarm, then facial expressions and other gestures that are associated with fright may be blocked or inhibited. We don't want other people to be able to identify our fright or our alarm or our shame. So someone may form patterns of chronic physical tension in their neck and face and head and so on in order to avoid harassment for any display of alarm or fright or caution. We don't want to be abused. We don't want to be targeted. We don't want to be harassed. We don't want to be attacked. We don't want to be ridiculed. We don't want to be ostracized. However, in some cases, we may think, the best outcome is to be expelled from this group, to be rejected from the group. We want to be cast out. We want to be excluded. If we can't withdraw on our own power, maybe we can produce repulsion in others so that we can still be safe from the harassment of the group. So there's lots of different variations. I'm trying to give you kind of the basic, most common forms here. So within that realm of ineffectiveness or reactivity, we'll review real quick. We can identify the first stage as frightened alarm, and the next stage as shame. It could be panic, but if it's panic and somebody just runs, that corresponds to frightened alarm. There's a way out. You run. That's the whole end of that process. Then you go back to calm alertness. You calm down eventually. So it is also possible for there to be frightened alarm, no way to escape, and so then shame or inhibition, self-suppression arises. So note that, as I had referenced earlier, frightened alarm is not inherently ineffective. Sometimes panicking or fleeing can produce very favorable results, safety, in other words. or privacy, seclusion, whatever. Nevertheless, actions performed in a panic are not always reliable. In fact, they're generally not reliable for producing favorable results. Panic doesn't work in many cases. Fleeing is impossible, or someone may pursue us faster than we can flee, in a kind of a predator-prey analogy. If some prey is targeted by a predator, fleeing doesn't mean they'll escape. It means it's possible that they'll escape, but they may not be fast enough to escape from a particular real threat. Now, most of the time with frightened alarms, the actual threat is probably a lot less than what people are displaying. A lot of, this is an aside, but in a lot of the social conditioning rituals, like in public schools and other group settings, there's a context of kind of implicit threat and social harassment and social ridicule and wanting to preserve social approval and attract more social approval and compete for social approval. In a setting like that, where there's a group setting, especially where it's a group setting where somebody has to go to it over and over again, they have no power to choose to be in the group or to leave, then shame is just almost an inevitable result. So if somebody gets to choose, do you want to go to the park? Do you want to join the soccer team or whatever? Especially if there's no commitment, it's just a free form. What do you want to do today? Kids aren't going to develop shame; they're going to develop discretion. But if the children are pressured into a situation where they have to commit to a big season of stuff, or their parents are on the behalf of the children are committing them to a season of things. We're getting a 5-month membership in the karate place, and the parent has paid for that whole thing, and they want to basically get their money's worth kind of mode. Well, that's one possible way that things can go. And in a case like that, there's a pressure, a context of social pressure, a concern for harassment, for ridicule, for criticism, and those all correspond to shame and shyness. So in a situation like that, simply panicking directly might not work. There might have to be a much more elaborate tantrum and theater in order to produce a interruption to the 5-month contract or the entire season. To get out of the season, you have to do something much more elaborate than say, I would rather watch TV, or I would rather play with my friends at home, or whatever. So, actions performed in a panic are generally not reliable for producing favorable results. They might, but often, or in many cases that are familiar or common, panicking doesn't work by itself. So shame is where we go. Number 1, frightened alarm, and then number 2, shame. So let's go back to the state of calm alertness and contrast a little bit here. The capacity to learn. Is it better when there's calm alertness, or better when there's frightened alarm and shame? The capacity, in fact, when there's calm alertness and curiosity and motivation to learn, well, then the capacity to learn is at its maximum. So the capacity to learn new methods or refine old methods is much greater in a state of calm alertness than in any state related to alarm or fright or shame. Our cognitive functionality is way better when there's calm alertness than when there's these hormones of adrenaline and cortisol and stress hormones that help us to run or fight, to flee. Those motor muscle hormones, that's pulling blood and other resources away from the brain and toward those motor muscles. Motor muscles means the muscles that allow us to move, like our leg muscles and our hip muscles and so on. So the capacity to learn new methods is higher in a state of calm alertness than in any other state. In other words, perceptiveness in the state of calm alertness is more likely. Intelligence in the state of calm alertness is more likely. Rapid learning, all kinds of cognitive functionality are maximum in a state of calm alertness. In contrast, the basic value of alarm and panic is that redistribution of energy from the brain and cognitive faculties to the muscles and motor capacity. And all that energy to the muscles allows for an organism to better fight or flee. So, backing up, I had already mentioned reactivity and responsiveness. Another way to label the two categories I've been describing, just as a reminder, would be reactive behavior and responsive behavior. Responsiveness is associated with calm alertness and rationality. Reactivity is associated with alarm, perceptions of significant risk, and hysterical social displays. And those hysterical social displays can be rather intricate and interesting, and we will talk more about that very soon. So within the reactive stages, first is what? Frightened, alarm, and then second is, if panic doesn't work, then shame. And you can even think of shame as kind of a type of panic. It's a panic that can't be physically expressed. There's a desire to escape, but no way to escape. So the panic doesn't result in running. It doesn't result in fighting. It results in freezing. Fight, flight, or freeze. And freeze is associated with shame. In fact, there's all these F words. There's fight, flight, freeze, and then fake. And we will come back to fake later. But faking is highly adaptive sometimes to, coping with perceived threats. Playing possum, I guess, is the most famous kind of fakery, is just to freeze and be still is one thing, but to play dead, to fall over, that's, to playing possum means to completely, submit. Even the possum's hormones, like they send out these hormones that stop the heartbeat of the possum temporarily or something like that. I'm not sure of all the details, but they're not just playing dead like a child might play dead. The possum is really, they've adapted and evolved to have this response that is very similar to actual death. I don't know if they technically pass out, but passing out would be a form. It's not fleeing, it's not fighting, it's an extreme form of freezing, right? We could go with that for simplicity. So, within these reactive stages, there's frightened alarm first, and then second, shame, and then a variety of compensations related to shame, or a variety of methods. Complicated methods or simple methods, many of them complicated, that are all related to shame. So to compensate for shame, what do people do? Well, people may adopt various kinds of idealism or perfectionism and then present themselves to others as heroic reformers or even saviors. And why would they do that? To distract people from shame and also to attract social validation, to attract social approval. So in that mode of compensating for shame, people are competing for social validation for their heroism. They're competing for social approval. So be clear that when there's a background of shame and people are compensating for that shame, there's a mode of competitiveness. It's not that they want to do something just to do it. They don't want to do something just to produce the result of it, the natural result of it. They want to do something to compensate for shame, to attract social approval, to attract social validation, to attract that message from the outside that they are safe. So they don't have an experience of safety, but they want to attract a reassurance from, whoever is in their midst, a group of people, an individual, and so on. And what can they do? Well, they can do good things. They can be a perfectionist. They can be heroic, and they can attract social validation, social approval. They can attract that message of reassurance and safety. So, because people often will compete for social validation, we can notice that they will form into groups. And all these groups are each competing for different reforms. In fact, as the different groups all pursue heroic reforms hysterically and passionately and sincerely, they may conflict with each other. I will give a silly example. It's not really an example, but I'll give a silly metaphor in a moment. So members of the various groups, because of their sincerity, because of their intention to reform, they will all claim heroism. Their heroism isn't in producing the result, it's in their good intentions. So the members of various groups, even though they have competing goals or conflicting goals, all of the groups will claim heroism. And they may also express confusion over how it could be that so many other people, or anyone at all, would be so hysterical that those other people, those idiots, those naive imbeciles, those retards, would pursue reforms that are contrary to the reforms selected by that individual or that group, the reforms which they pursue so loyally and so sincerely. If somebody wants to be the grammar police, they are going to save everybody from bad grammar and show that they are loyal to good grammar. I might have done that on occasion. And there's nothing wrong with, proofing what you write and typing, precisely and correcting what you type and using good grammar. Those are fine. But there's a kind of hysteria and shame over mistakes that's distinct from just valuing precision. Valuing, the effectiveness that is associated with precision. Yeah, so precision for its own sake is perfectionism. Precision because it's useful is a different kind of precision. That's a real attention to precision, not a anxious attention to precision. So back to these reformers who are all ashamed because they have frightened alarm and they don't want anybody to know it. So the reformers all compete against opposing groups of reformers. I mean, that's kind of a very common thing. Because of the intensity of their antagonism towards the opposing groups, immense amounts of resources can be invested into the role. There was a typing error in my script here. Because of the intensity of their antagonism towards each other, immense amounts of resources can be invested into performing a role or to producing an outcome, but with little or no effectiveness towards actually producing the intended outcome or the intended outcomes. Given that there are competing groups with different outcomes in mind, even contrary outcomes, the groups all are investing lots of time and energy and attention and resources into being reformers and saviors, but their actual effectiveness may be limited. They may be very frustrated or exhausted for all of their reforms. So here's my analogy. It might have been ideal for me to say this analogy earlier, but as an imperfect perfectionist, dang it, I'm saying it now and I didn't say it earlier. Here's the great and wonderful perfect analogy. It's like there are two groups passionately involved in changing the depth of a hole. So it's like there's a hole in the ground, and there's two groups that are passionately and heroically involved in changing the depth of that hole. One group vigorously digs deeper, while the other group heroically fills up the hole as fast as possible. Neither group is satisfied by the results produced, of course, so both groups hysterically promote continuing to use the exact same methods that they've been using, but going much faster and with much more ferocity and faith and loyalty and all those kind of things. Greater optimism, greater enthusiasm. We just need to have more faith. And so one group fills the hole with great faith and optimism and enthusiasm, and the other group digs the hole deeper with great faith and enthusiasm and optimism, and that is all this reactive mode. They're competing for social validation and approval and heroism and perfectionism and all that. So, you know what really is the problem here with the the two groups where, according to those within the groups, they may say things like, it's not that there's a group opposing us. I mean, that is horrible and retarded that there is anybody so dumb as to want to fill the hole while we're, digging it deeper. But, if we're digging it deeper, and yeah, those people are trying to fill the hole, but you know what it is? I think the real problem is that our laborers, our diggers, they're just too lazy. They need to work longer hours. They need to work harder. You know, so there's all of these excuses and rationales and complexity around why it's not working. Why is there so much inefficiency? Why is there so much frustration? Why is there so much? Why is there any frustration? We'll come back to frustration a little more later. So, in the mode of reactivity, it can be complex and kind of can suck. There can be a lot of suffering in that, a lot of agonizing and agony in the mode of reactivity, as distinct from the mode of calm alertness. So, in the mode of reactivity, there is a kind of a mirroring of the stages of rational effectiveness and responsiveness. There is a goal that's identified, just like from calm alertness and innate motivation. However, that goal is socially oriented. It's for social approval. It's for social validation, social heroism. So there's a goal that's identified in both cases, and there's a method that may be identified in the case of reactivity. Here's the reform, or the way we're going to promote reform. And then there can also be a gathering of resources and expertise in order to apply the chosen method very well and to fulfill the targeted goal. And, hopefully attract social approval and validation as the best savior ever and the best perfectionist ever. Now, even though there's that similarity and mirroring in the mode of reactivity that's a lot like the mode of responsiveness, there is a major contrast in the actual way that people operate within, those two different modes. So in the event that people operating in the reactive mode are somehow ever effective at producing a stated goal, and actually this happens relatively frequently, if they're ever successful at producing a stated goal, they will not be fulfilled simply by the production of their stated goal, because their stated goal was never really the issue. That stated goal was itself a means to compensate for shame and attract social validation and approval. Producing the goal by itself they will be disappointed almost inevitably. If they do produce the goal, they will be disappointed that they've produced it, because now they know that goal doesn't bring them the lasting and permanent social validation and approval that they were hoping for, that they were targeting for. It doesn't resolve their underlying shame. So they fulfill the goal. They have that glee and celebration and glory, and then eventually that dissipates, and they realize, I'm disappointed by this. I'm not getting as much social approval as clearly I deserve. So they can either, move back towards calm alertness and the relaxing of shame, or they can find a new reform and a new heroic outcome to target. So if they produce the stated goal, they will still be hungry for more social validation. You get a little, well, then they're going to target an even bigger goal for even more social validation, because the social validation is passing. It comes. It's there's a surge of it. It may be ongoing. It may be lasting, but they want more, bigger. If it's all about compensating for shame and attracting approval and attracting that reassurance of you're okay, if that's the real thing in the background, then accomplishing one goal is not going to have any lasting fulfillment. It's not going to produce lasting fulfillment. So they'll be hungry for social validation for the fulfillment of their next heroic goal, unless they start to relax their shame and move towards calm alertness and on from there. And one of the challenges is, if you're moving from shame toward calm alertness, what do you have to go through? Well, there may be some frightened alarm to actually recognize, and to practice calm breathing and other things that promote relaxation and calm. Not because relaxation and calm are better than other states, but because relaxation and calm alertness is the gateway to responsiveness and effectiveness. So, someone operating in the mode of reactivity, they react. They hysterically react. and it can be quite unfavorable for them. And eventually they may get that it's not just the specific thing that they're involved, the specific activities that they're doing, but it's their whole way of life, you could say, their whole mode of operation. So in contrast to reactivity, someone operating in the responsive mode not only does not need external encouragement or validation, but may prefer to generally be left alone or even to operate in secret. In the case of a group of people all working together in responsive mode, then as a group, they may have rules of discretion, modesty, or even secrecy. So the person in the reactivity mode, they may want secrecy, at a certain point, stage in time. But once they've accomplished their goal, they want, to be celebrated and glorified and paraded around. The person who's operating to pursue innate motivations in that responsive mode, they don't need social validation. In fact, they may prefer privacy, prefer anonymity. So when a person in the responsive mode does not accomplish their goal through the use of a certain method, what is their reaction? In contrast to the person in the frightened alarm mode, if they don't get what they want, they're going to be upset. They're going to blame, whose fault is this? Who's victimized me? The person in the responsive mode, if they don't accomplish their goal through the use of a certain method, they want to know what result did they get, and they want to know it as quickly as possible. They want to know, is this effective? Is it ineffective? How effective is it? How ineffective is it? Exactly how is it effective? And how can they improve it? Or is it as a method that they just discard, or they don't have enough resources to use it well, or they need somebody who's better at it, a better mentor, if they're getting an auto mechanic, they need somebody who's better trained than the person who's just an amateur mechanic or a novice student or practitioner. So in that mode of innate motivation, they want to know, is this method working? Is it working well? That's important. That's valuable to them. If the results are disappointing, they want to know. They don't want to avoid disappointment. They want to get satisfaction or disappointment as quickly as possible. They're open to the experience of disappointment. They're open to learning. They're open to increased effectiveness, to efficiency, to producing the result that they're innately motivated to pursue. So they're open to refining their methods or to discarding methods that are not a good fit for whatever reason at a particular time, for a particular person, whatever. Maybe they'll use that method again at a later time, maybe not. Doesn't even matter. Calm alertness is like permeating their entire process. And if their first methods do not produce astonishing effectiveness, they do not experience frustration because they didn't expect a method to work with a desperate background of shame. If there's a desperate background of shame and I try one method and it doesn't work or it's not working very well, I don't even want to know. And when I eventually, if there's that background of desperate shame, and I'm trying to compensate for shame and attract social approval, if my method isn't working and I eventually admit it's not working, then what do I get? I get frustration. It's intense. It sucks. So when a method does not work and the ineffectiveness of the method is experienced as shameful, that's a sign. What is it a sign of when a method doesn't work and its ineffectiveness is experienced as shameful? That's a sign that someone is operating in a mode that is reactive, not responsive. Why is the ineffective result shameful? Well, because there's already a context of latent shame or a momentum of shame in the background or just below the surface. So a person in a responsive mode of calm alertness, clear goals, innate motivations that they're pursuing, they won't be dismayed or disheartened by the discovery that a particular method is not fully satisfying or effective. They'll be even curious how, there's just constant, how can I make it more effective? If it's effective, cool. How can I make it more effective? If it's moderately effective, cool. How can I make it at least, decently effective? If it's generally ineffective, should I drop it or should I, revise it in ways that's going to make it at least moderately effective? Very calm, just alert, very committed. They actually want the goals they say they want. In the case of frightened alarm and shame as a compensation, people don't really want the things they say they want for themselves, for producing that result. They're producing that result because they're hoping that it will attract social validation, social approval, social reassurance. So a person in a responsive mode will not be dismayed or disheartened by the discovery that a particular method is not fully satisfying or effective. They experience an innate internal commitment to getting clear on what they value. They want to really know what do they value. And then they want to learn how to get what they value. Whatever they value, where there's that real commitment and motivation, not a pretense, but a real authentic, innate, powerful, magnetic motivation, they're going to want to know how to get that. And then they're going to want to actually get it. They don't just want to know what it is and want to know how to get it. They want to get it. So how long it takes for them to get it or what method they use is relatively trivial to them. Someone operating in shame is usually hesitant to admit that a method is not working or to admit to shame about a method not working. Because their commitment to a particular method and a particular goal is entirely a mechanism for compensating for shame, their primary goal is actually hiding their shame, not producing the stated result. They distract themselves from their shame, and they distract others from their shame, or at least they attempt to do so. They gather together into groups in which they collaborate in distracting each other from shame, and perhaps speculating on the best ways to be a heroic perfectionist reformer savior. They just want to talk about how should we change the world. They might not, do anything, but let's talk about how we should change the world. Why do they do that? Because they're socializing, they're networking with people, but they're also operating from a coping mechanism to distract themselves from their frightened alarm. The reality is there's frightened alarm in the background. And that's awesome. In fact, all of their, speculations on making the world better and making, saving humanity from humanity or whatever, all of that socializing, it can be fun. It can be, you meet people. You may eventually, if you were to do that, you may eventually find that you want to meet other people. The people you meet in that mode and in that process aren't the people you want to, continue to invest time in and so on. But that's all part of the learning process. So everything in the mode of reactivity is still learning. It's just kind of a slow anti-learning learning, like resisting learning. But learning still happens anyway. So people gather together to talk about the best ways to be a heroic perfectionist reformer savior. Do they actually ever launch a campaign to produce the reforms that they worship? Do people ever really take actions to launch a campaign that produce the reforms that they worship, or do they just talk about how those reforms would be great, should already be present, and why it sucks that other people are preventing them and betraying them by not being interested enough, and how can people not see that this is the best heroic perfectionist savior reform? Why is there a diversity of opinions? Why isn't there consensus on this? So sometimes they want to harass people who aren't sufficiently enthusiastic. Not just are they going to ridicule people who are opposing to them, but they're going to ridicule people who are neutral, or who are even in favor of whatever they target, but are insufficiently enthusiastic according to them, or who promote the wrong method. We have the same outcome in mind, but they can actually have contempt and hatred and a sense of betrayal with regard to people who simply prefer a different method towards that same outcome. That wouldn't be what happens when there's calm alertness. There's no contempt or sense of betrayal for people who are thinking another method might be useful or a good supplement or whatever. That's why would you have contempt or hatred when there's calm alertness? Only when there's shame and an intention to hide shame would there be contempt and hatred and so forth in that sense. So here's how here's how the world should be. Here's how we could fix it. Do they actually ever start that campaign to fix it, to enact the reforms? Well, the more desperate that they are to appear sincere, then the more likely it is that they will invest resources like time and money into their heroic campaigns to compensate for shame by attracting social validation from their collaborators in particular. So the more desperate that I am to appear sincere, the more I want to attract social validation from the other people who are also desperate to, to appear heroic and sincere and all that. So we gather together. We are repulsed by all these people who are insufficiently enthusiastic or retardedly don't see the importance of the target outcome that we have in mind. They don't want to prevent what we want to prevent. They don't want to produce what we want to produce, and we have contempt and hatred and ill will towards all these. The absence of consensus, because we want social approval when we're operating in that mode. So in review and in summary, there are two distinct modes of behavior, reactive and responsive. The responsive mode begins with what? Calm alertness. It can be punctuated by occasional moments of a sense of humor, by the way. But it begins with calm alertness and then develops into an awareness of an innate motivation or even just a curiosity. And that will typically be followed by explorations of how to produce whatever favored result. And then after there's that kind of speculation and consideration of what would be a good result, good method for producing the result, there will be experimentation generally to do what it takes to produce that result. Apply that method. Gather the resources necessary for that method. Gather the expertise relevant for that method, and so on. That's in stark contrast to the reactive mode. The reactive mode begins with frightened alarm, and then a chronic conflict of shame, in which all signals of alarm and fright, such as certain facial expressions, are suppressed. There's the experience of fright and alarm, but there's a conflict in the sense of wanting to physically block the display of those signals of alarm and fright, as well as the signals of shame and shyness. Next, in order to distract oneself and those in one's midst from shame and fright and alarm, there can be speculations about how to make the world better, or how to save the world, how to reform whatever. And then, in some cases, there will be an identifying of tangible methods for potentially producing whatever outcome is imagined would attract social validation, social approval, social reassurance, and so on. Finally, there's the possibility of actually investing in the application of a particular method in pursuit of a goal of heroic reforms, which then hopefully will attract social validation, glory, reassurance, approval, celebration, and so on. So in traditional religious terms, I'm reminded of some of the statements of Isaiah and Jesus. The second mode that I'm calling reactivity, they actually use the term, or translated in English, whatever language they were speaking. In the English translations, we see the word vanity. So in vain, or in vanity, in an arrogant sense of attempting to attract social approval. In vanity, as distinct from impurity, in purity. There's Titus 1:15. That's the name of a book of the Bible and a chapter and verse. Titus 1:15. To the pure, all things are pure. So there's this reference to purity. If we could say there's also vanity or an internal corruption or an internal conflict or an internal disturbance, for people who have that internal disturbance, there's lots of external triggers that will bring to the surface their internal disturbance. So that's the other portion of Titus 1:15. I'm paraphrasing the latter portion there. But these contrasts that I've mentioned are certainly not new. They didn't, it's not like they haven't been around for a while. These contrasts have been around. The reactive mode, the responsive mode, it's been around long before, I made this audio, long before this century, long before whatever. It's been around for a long time. So there's reactivity, there's responsiveness, there's calm alertness, and everything that goes with calm alertness. And there is frightened alarm. And we can respect and be calmly alert to the reality of frightened alarm and shame and the various complications and conflicts that typically result from attempting to compensate for the shame of frightened alarm. Nothing really shameful about frightened alarm. However, that's kind of interesting to note.